And now our host, Stephen Lee Morris.
Last week, we were joined by performer activist Vanessa Stewart, who filled us in on her attempts to work with advocates and the state legislature to provide some kind of exemption or carve out for small theaters from the more pernicious effects of Assembly Bill 5, which went into effect in January of 2020. Assembly Bill 5 is legislation that, with some exception, eliminates the status of independent contractors in almost all businesses in the state of California, converting those people to employees, which means they are supposed to have benefits. There are state safety and health rules and regulations that apply to them, and the cost of those benefits, which in small businesses can be anywhere between 30 to 70% of the annual budget, the cost of those benefits is borne by the employers, which in this case is the people, in the case of small theaters, means the people running those theaters. There was subsequent legislation called Assembly Bill 2257, which did manage to successfully create carve-outs for some categories of workers. These included musicians, video photographers, editors, freelance journalists, and others. But the theaters are still under the mandate of the law, which is why Vanessa is trying to find some kind of carve out. This week, with enormous gratitude to the California Lawyers for the Arts, we're joined by Bryan Hawkins, who is a partner with Stowell Rives in Sacramento. Bryan is a litigator practicing in the firm's labor and employment group with extensive jury and bench trial experience. He represents employers in employment-related litigation in court and before administrative agencies such as the Department of Fair Employment and Housing and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. His practice also involves counseling employers on employment-related issues, such as handbooks and policies. While in San Francisco, Bryan also served as a deputy district attorney with the San Francisco County District Attorney's Office. Bryan Hawkins, welcome to Animal Farm.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. You have experience in your legal practice working with employers who are suffering the fallout from AB5. I'm wondering if, from a legal perspective, if we could get your sense of what this law actually is, and then what the owners of a small nonprofit business can do to survive it and endure it if it can't be overturned legislatively.
Of course. So basically what AB5 does, it changes the way in which employers can classify the workers as either employees or as independent contractors. And that's a very critical distinction because, again, employees are entitled to things such as overtime, rest breaks, meal breaks, etc., when contractors are not. So it's a really big difference. So before AB5, there was a case called Borrello. And Borrello basically was a rule in California for 20 or 30 years. And that rule generally said that in order to classify someone as a contractor, you need to show that the person is independent, that they're doing their jobs that you tell them to do, but they're choosing the means and how to achieve that job. So for example, if I hire someone to paint my house, I tell the painter, I want a sky blue house. I don't care what types of paint you use. I don't care about the paint brushes, about your workers, just get me that sky blue house. In that case, the worker is in control of how they achieve the goal. So that person is a contractor. Now, what the law changed to was there was a case by the Supreme Court called Dynamics. And Dynamics said that Borrello is no longer the law of the land. Instead, it's going to be a three-pronged test called the ABC test. And that ABC test has three prongs. First, it presumes that anyone doing work is an employee. In order to overcome that presumption, the employer must show, one, that the person's independent, two, that the work being done is outside of the scope of the person's business, and three, that the person doing the work has an independent job, an independent business or profession. That's kind of the basis of the ABC test. And what AB5 did, AB5 took that California Supreme Court law and codified it into a statute. So what the end result of all that is it's much harder for now for employers to show that their workers are independent contractors rather than employees. And because of that, that places a huge burden on employers and in some cases on employees as well.
Can a case be made, but before we get to actors in theaters, which is most of our readership, or most of our audience, I should say, the how does this affect, say, a designer who was brought in to design a theater production and then leaves after opening night? Under the new law, are they, and could they still be an independent contractor, or do they fall under employee?
It's possible for them still to, it's possible for them to be independent contractors. It's going to relate to exactly what the employers, how they define their business. If they define their business broadly to include putting on productions for patrons, then it's going to be very difficult because again, the job the person's doing, designing costumes, is within the scope of the business, so to speak, of putting on a production. Yeah. So in that case, the person more likely than not is going to be properly classified as an employee rather than as a contractor.
Yeah. And so with actors, the same would apply, perhaps even more so.
Exactly. And again, you have to remember this law was more or less, at least AB 5, was put in place to stop or to control Uber, Lyft, the big tech companies with lots of gig workers. It was meant for the gig economy. Yes. It wasn't meant for the small theaters, the small businesses in a lot of ways. And ironically enough, due to the ordinance, the statute passed last year, now Uber and Lyft are exempted essentially from this law.
So, leaving small theater producers holding the bag.
Exactly, in a lot of ways, yes.
Yeah. So they are working in Los Angeles on finding some kind of carve out in the manner of Assembly Bill 2257 that exempted musicians, that exempted journalists, freelance journalists, etc. Yes. What can be done for these theaters to help ensure their survival if the legislative solution is not successful?
It's a great question, and one that I've been asked time and time again, and I give the same answer. Basically, if you have two choices as a small theater, either comply perfectly with AB 5 and go out of business because you can't afford it, or do your best with complying, understand that there are risks associated with that, then that really leaves you that doesn't really leave you much of a choice.
What are the risks?
The risks are kind of twofold. The first risk is it's possible that the California Enforcement Agency comes after you and says you're violating California law and seeks to enforce penalties. That's kind of risk number one. And to be honest, that risk, while always possible, typically a smaller theater with 40 or so workers is not going to be the high target, the priority target for an enforcement agency. Again, not saying it can't happen, not saying it won't happen, but it's a smaller target than say a bigger, larger company with hundreds of thousands of employees. So that's kind of risk number one. The more likely risk is that you have a worker who is happy, who's doing a good job. Somehow they get disgruntled. Yep. They are separated, and then they sue you for violating California law. That is the much more likely scenario, and that's one that honestly it's difficult to avoid. But that's the larger risk.
From what you've seen, can you make an assessment on the possibilities of a legislative fix for something that seems so out of balance with the original intent of the law, which was to stop exploitation on multi-million-dollar companies? And here we have these both startup and existing theater companies that barely break even, and they have this extraordinary burden of anywhere from 30% to 70% increase in their annual budget, which is potentially door closing. Do you see, from your experience, you saw the legislative solution go through with the AB 2257, which made carve out safe for musicians. How difficult or easy is that? Is that something the theater community here can realistically bank on or hope for, or is there any way you could tell?
You know, it's hard to tell. I think the law will be further refined. And again, one thing to keep in mind is that these exemptions from AB5 do not necessarily mean that the people are automatically contractors. They just mean that that analysis is pursuant to the old law, Borrello, rather than the ABC test.
Yes.
And to be honest, lots of smaller theaters, even under Borrello, had questionable classifications of their workers. Again, it's much harder now, but Borrello wasn't a slam dunk for small theaters either. But it kind of answering your question, time's gonna tell. It's hard to tell. The best thing you can do is talk to your lobbyists if you have any. Talk to your representatives. Get them and show them why this law in its current form is so harmful to smaller companies. Again, knowing the fact that they were not the main target of AB5. So again, talk to your representatives, talk to your lobbyists, get a groundswell of support for additional exemptions, and hope that they pass. Again, I don't see anything on the horizon right now because again, this year so much attention is devoted to COVID, and rightfully so. Yes. That it may be harder to kind of get to so much attention focused on creating laws to help employees due to COVID that it may be harder to kind of refine other laws that may be pushed a little bit to the back burner, at least for the time being, unfortunately.
Just because of legislative priorities.
Exactly.
Maybe a final question, and that's from your experience, from what you've seen working in these cases, it's fairly clear how the employers suffer, but mainly through budgetary cuts through the effect of this. What's the upside, and what are there any unintended consequences for the employees, for the workers themselves from this legislation that hadn't been imagined?
No, of course. I think one of the biggest downsides for workers is that employers have a disincentive to engage more workers. If you feel that with every worker you hire, there is a risk of litigation, a risk of being sued, of being assessed penalties, the only rational result of that is to hire fewer people. Yeah. So I definitely do think there's a detriment to workers. And again, some people don't want to be employees. They want to be contractors. They yes. like the freedom. They don't want to be tied down. But again, there are definitely downsides to employees, to workers, and to people who just want to be contractors, who do not want the full burden in some respect of being employees.
Yeah. And Bryan Hawkins, thank you for joining us.
No, of course. It's a pleasure and happy to be here. Thank you again.
Next week, we're joined by KCRW's host of the weekly theater segment, Opening the Curtain, Anthony Burns. Anthony is a director, producer, educator, critic, and arts administrator based in Los Angeles. He has served as the founding artistic director of Burning Wheel and the Umbrella Company. He is a director of cultural relations for the University of Southern California, an associate producer of new play development for Center Theatre Group.